where we are busy putting death out of business. I want to thank Thrivous first for sponsoring this episode. Link is in the rules are in the description. Goes from $5 all the way up to $160. If you want to get yourself some Thrivous, you say thanks Thrivous, and you'll get some geoprotectors and nootropics and some other great things. Also want to thank I Am Transhuman for sponsoring this episode. Now, thank you very much. Now we're going to cross over to the great Ron Pike. He's here. He's self-isolated. He's staying safe from the stupid COVID-19 virus that's zipping around the world, causing chaos. And we're going to talk about the virus. We're going to talk about the impacts on the economy. Also, I want to get some ideas on what this means to the Australian farmers who have suffered through drought, if this is a good thing or bad thing. So, Ron, quickly introduce yourself to the audience. We've had you on before. We're going to have you on again and again and again because your wisdom is super important in these trying times. But just quickly introduce yourself to the audience, and we'll rock into the Australian economic crisis that's here. It's here.
Yes, thank you, Steele. These days I'm a self-funded retiree. I spent nearly all of my working life in irrigated agriculture in the Riverina, but also worked around southern Queensland and northern New South Wales. Since I've been retired and up here in Coffs Harbour, I have worked almost full-time on endeavouring to get good water policy for the people of Australia. I have worked, at this stage we have totally failed because the government has implemented policy which has transformed a country and country people from having abundant water to no water at all in a lot of cases. And of course, as you mentioned, and the government uses this as an excuse, they blame the drought. It wasn't a drought. The recent drought that finished with the rain about a month ago was relatively short. It had only existed in New South Wales for about 12 months. In the whole of southern of New South Wales, it never ever was declared a drought. We had plenty of rain, but yet we found ourselves with 6 empty dams, 7 dry rivers, municipalities with no water, and farmers, irrigation farmers, that have had no water now for 2.5 years. So we beg the question, and we demand of the government, how did this happen?
And, you know, just to interject really quickly, we did have you on with Topher Field, who's a great guy. He's doing fantastic work out there. I really support Topher Field and all his work. And we had a debate or a conversation with you and Topher. We tried to get Fraser Ranning on the show as well to weigh in about some projects in North Queensland. But yes, it comes down to a scheme, the MDBA, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Do you want to quickly expand on the tragedy of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority?
Yes, and just before I do, I'd like to say that Topher Field and I are as one on all of this. We don't disagree on one point. The introduction of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is going to go down in history as the biggest mistake ever made by federal government. It was never necessary. It was contrary to Section 100 of the Australian Constitution, and we can blame Malcolm Turnbull for disregarding that and pushing it through federal parliament. What it has done, it has removed water, our stored water, from productive enterprises and given control of that water to green bureaucracies and profiteers. It is an absolute disaster, and until it is completely overturned, and again, Topher and I totally agree on this, it can't be fixed, it can't be amended, it has to be repealed.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole charade needs to be dismantled and thrown into the waste bin of history. It's done more damage than good, and it's federal messing with water allocations. That they don't understand the volumes that they're doing, and they misallocate resources, and it's a big mess. And you're right. You know, the drought. It's a scapegoat. But what do you think? With this economic fiasco that's going on in the world, is more money going to Australian farmers, because we are a food exporter, Ron Pike. We're a food exporter as an aggregate, as a nation. But it seems like a lot of a lot of imports and exports have dried up because of this virus. Do you think farmers are now getting a little bit more cash in their pockets because of the greater domestic demand for food, or do you think that's a wrong assumption?
No, it's because farmers have not, for the last nearly 2 years now, in the most productive area of Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin itself produces 40% of Australia's agricultural production. Right across the Murray-Darling Basin, the amount of production there now has dropped by nearly 60% of that. So that's why the shortages of things, but it's all caused by the taking away of the basic inputs that farmers need to produce. And the most basic of all is water, but don't underestimate the increasing cost of electricity and gas and fuel. They are the four tools of trade that no matter what you're producing, you must have. What has the government done? It has made all of those tools of trade, the inputs to productivity, scarce and expensive. None of it was necessary, but they're not looking like any mea culpas anytime soon. They're just sitting there. I'm trying to have a meeting with Keith Pitt, the new Minister for Water. He's agreed to talk to me, but so far he's managed to avoid having that meeting for nearly 2 months. So that's what we're up against.
It's a tragic circumstance, and with the Aussie dollar now crashing to new lows, fresh lows, that's not going to help even though fuel is coming down because of these oil price wars in Saudi Arabia and Russia. The tragedy of the Australian dollar will put further pressure on oil imports, which will keep that price artificially high as well. But it might stimulate exports. Is that a bright spot with the crashing dollar? When the dollar crashes, exports go up. Is it now cheaper to export food?
We can't produce the food. That's the problem. Okay, it probably suits the miners, those digging up coal and iron ore and alumina and a few other things. But there is a crisis in rural Australia at the moment, and the politicians don't seem to understand that there are now at least, my support base, if I can call it that, or our support base, is at least 1.5 million people. All of that 1.5 million people will never, ever vote National, Liberal or Labor again because they've been too badly hurt. And you're going to see the kicking out of Parliament of a lot of fairly high-profile people, and they'll be replaced by people that the majority have never heard of, but they will be people who are patriotic to regional communities. And that's going to happen at the next election. I can absolutely guarantee that.
And who are what's the characterization? What are these people like? Is it Pauline Hanson? Is it Katter type people? Is it someone we haven't heard? Is it shooters, fishers, and farmers, or is it some new party?
It's effectively all of the above. One Nation will probably pick up a couple more seats. Shooters and fishers certainly will. But there's a rise out there of high-profile, well-known independents. Will other parties be formed? There's a heap of smaller parties out there now, all of which are going nowhere, in my opinion. But don't lose sight of the fact that Clive Palmer's still sitting there in the background with more money than he knows what to do with, and he will quite likely support some of these people. It may not be a Palmer party, but he is very passionate about seeing things.
Or the top, let's say, 5 policies that they should be following to help these communities.
Very, very simple. And before I tell you what they are, I have put a document out there called The Road to National Prosperity. Any party that adopts that will win seats all over the country. Initially, what they have to do is replace the current Murray-Darling Basin plan with the plan that works for all, which is part of that document.
Yep.
They need to nationalise the power industry, both the distribution and the production of power. Selling all of those assets off to profiteers was the silliest thing that we've probably, not the silliest thing we've ever done. It's not as bad as the water, but it's close to it. And I'll give you an example of just how devious and dishonest our federal politicians are at the moment. They recognise that power's too expensive and it's killed off a lot of manufacturing industry, and it's in the process of killing off all of our smelting industry. And we were one of the biggest smelters, we're certainly the biggest smelters of aluminium in the world. We hear the Prime Minister say, oh, I've appointed Mr Taylor and his main job is to get the price of power down. Well, that sounds good. Here's the facts. The greatest price gouger in electricity production in Australia is Snowy Hydro. Who owns it? The federal government. No other producer of electricity in Australia, or in the world for that matter, has legislation which allows them to charge up to $14,000 a megawatt hour for power. You know how much it costs them to produce that? About $8. Now that's our government, excuse me for being blunt, screwing the people, and the hypocrisy of saying that they're out there trying to get the price of power down is just a nonsense. And the first thing that should happen, or should happen as part of the nationalisation of the production of power, we need to restart Hazelwood Power Station, for goodness sake. It's sitting there on one of the biggest deposits of brown coal in the world. It's so cheap, it's ridiculous. And what have we done? We've closed it down. So the end result of that is, if you look at the graph of the amount of water left in the Snowy scheme at the moment, it's actually down to 15%. If it gets down to 10%, and it will if it doesn't rain, the lights are going to go out in Sydney and Melbourne. The reason is all of that water, rather than being saved and used for irrigation and so on, has been flushed down the other side of the mountain to keep the lights on in Sydney and Melbourne at between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 10 or 11 o'clock at night. That's where the water's gone.
That's disturbing. And you know, where can people, you know, you mentioned these great graphs. Obviously, you know, Michael Smythe, I've had him on the show. We talk about the road to the path to national prosperity document a lot. He's a big fan of that document. But where can people find this graph, for example, about the water tables of different dams? For example, this Snowy Hydro project. Where can people go to find this information for themselves?
If they go onto my Facebook page, it's all there. And I post regularly on it. I check the water levels in all the dams about 8:30 every morning, including Snowy Hydro. I've been doing it now for about 15 years. It's available online for anyone that wants to find it, and anyone who hasn't got the link to that, just touch base with me on Facebook and I'll give it to you.
Fantastic. All right, so go and talk to Ron Pike on Facebook and he'll be happy to provide that link, because I certainly want to look at that more. You know, that's very disturbing to think of that, you know, that the Snowy Hydro project is being used in this way, not for something productive in terms of agriculture, but for energy production, when there are substitutes for energy production. You know, there's not really a substitute for agricultural production. You either have food or you don't have food. You know, so it is kind of disturbing to think that this is something that's going on. You know, you mentioned the diminishment of manufacturing and smelting in Australia. Do you think this is what do you think of the nuclear debate, nuclear power? Are you a fan of nuclear power? Are you scared of nuclear power? What do you think about nuclear power?
I have no problem with nuclear power, but there's two things that push it to one side initially. It's still actually quite expensive. And because of all the regulation we got in place, if we decided to build a nuclear power station tomorrow, it would be about 12 or 14 years before it came online. By the same token, we can restart Hazelwood the day after tomorrow if we were serious. More importantly, we are shockingly short of water storage capacity. We have put before the government, way back in 2014, the plans for all of the water storage we need to build in Australia that would look after our water supply for the next 100 years. As we start building that water storage, every one of those water storages becomes a hydroelectric generating capacity as well. Here's the important thing. The cheapest power in Australia is still hydropower. And what are we talking about? Once again, at the behest of that man that went into politics and wrecked everything he touched, Malcolm Turnbull, Snowy 2. And everyone's saying, oh, we're going to build Snowy 2. Why would we build Snowy 2, and they're talking about it now costing $6,000 million, and use 130 units of power to generate 100 units of power? Now, that makes no sense whatsoever. For $6 million, we could build the Upper Clarence scheme, the plans for which have been put with government. The Upper Clarence scheme would produce 2.5 times the total power production of the Snowy hydro. We have, I'm reluctant to say this, but I feel compelled to say it. We have today representatives in Canberra who have to be the most self-serving, incompetent group of people that I've been dealing in politics for, I hate to admit this, well over 50 years. I have never seen a lower standard of representation in that 55 years. Never.
And just, I want to talk about the current economic crisis and stuff, but it sounds very disheartening to think, that we've come up at such a pivotal point in our history, and this is a sort of the group of politicians. This is the collective that we have to deal with. It doesn't sound very encouraging. It doesn't give you much hope for the future. It just fills you with all sorts of sense of uncertainty. I'm not liking uncertainty right now, Ron. Don't.
Oh, look, it's been a frustration of mine for some years, but I'll just give you an example. In 2014, when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, I was asked by the Australian Water Exploration Company, which are a not-for-profit company, who had spent 10 years of their own time and about $2 million of their own money researching all the water conservation projects across mainland Australia. They asked me to present that to the federal government, which we did. We all went down to Canberra, met with Tony Abbott, or my wife and I met with him the evening before. He got back to me the next morning via one of his staff, and he said, Ron, this is fantastic. We must start implementing this straight away. I gave a full PowerPoint presentation, which lasted for about 40 minutes, explaining where the dams needed to be built, how we financed them, blah, blah, blah. When I was finished, and I don't mind making this public, I recently made it public about 3 months ago. Michael McCormick, who was then not Deputy PM, came up and shook my hand and he said, Ron, that was a very good presentation, but you need to know it won't go anywhere. We will never build another dam in Australia. That man is now Deputy Prime Minister, running around talking about building dams, but his heart's not in it. We went from that presentation to a special meeting in Barnaby Joyce's office, which included the Minister for Water, Simon Birmingham, and his advisor. Tony Abbott's had a staff member there. We started going, and this was at the behest of the Prime Minister. How and when do we start this? Barnaby Joyce and Michael McCormick and Simon Birmingham's staffer killed all of those plans, and they've never seen the light of day since. So you can appreciate my frustration. Now we've got McCormick running around saying, oh, we're going to bring experts in from other parts of the world.
Where are all these clowns gone to? Did they just slink off into the night, or what?
Sorry, I missed that.
Where did all these clowns disappear to? Did they all slink off into the night, or are they still hanging around in the...
No, they're still hanging around. The chief water advisor to the then minister is still a water advisor in Canberra. And so the reason I'm telling you that is there is an undercurrent of people in the governing class, and they're not all elected representatives. A lot of them are very highly paid advisors who are totally opposed to providing Australia with sufficient water or fuel or gas or electricity. They come from this mould of people who want to see depopulation in regional Australia. And it's a very, very hard thing to accept that these people are there, but they are.
Why would anybody want to see depopulation in regional Australia? Do they not see the problems that when you clump everyone up in cities, when a virus breaks out, you can have civil unrest in minutes? I mean, what are these people thinking?
I don't know, but it was the basis of the original Wentworth report. And John Howard made the mistake of accepting everything they said. But what you see playing out at the moment, and I'll give you an example, beautiful little town on the Edwards River called Deniliquin. It has lost 1,800 people in the last 3 years. The town of Walkill further to the west is just about closed down. There used to be 130 kids in the school, and now there's 12. And people in the city, I'm sure, don't realise this.
No, they don't. No, I'll tell you for a fact they don't. They don't realise, nor do they care, because they feel safe in numbers. That the fact that they can just vote in their own interests and take resources away from these regional groups. And then if you can't beat them, if you can't be in the regional areas, you have to join the greater majority. And that is the distressing part about representational democracy, because some representational regions have a greater population mass, and so those resources get pulled from those other areas. So of course the urbanite city population doesn't care, nor do they know, because it's not in their interest to know nor care.
Absolutely true. The biggest taxpayer subsidy in Australia is to capital city public transport.
Yeah.
It's now in excess of $11,000 million a year. So why are our cities booming and regional areas dying? Well, that's one of the reasons. If the people in the Sydney and Melbourne and the greater Brisbane area were paying the true cost of their public transport, two things had happened. The price of real estate in the cities had dropped dramatically, and a lot of people would leave and go and live in Wagga and Tamworth and Shepparton, and there's wonderful country towns and wonderful regional centres that are much cheaper to live in, got wonderful facilities, but what are we doing? We're pouring all of our taxpayer money into the cities because that's where the votes are.
Yeah, it's where the votes are. It's where the big financial industry is. It's where the money gets dumped, and so they kind of built a moat around themselves. And a lot of people aspire to live in the castle, in the moat around the CBD, but really they're not going to be allowed into the big boys club. They're on the periphery of that club, and they're just the aspirational class that gets ripped off with the higher cost of living and all the expenses that come living in a city. I live in a city. Unfortunately, I actually used to live in Canberra, which is not really a city. It's much better than that. I lived there for many years, and I had to move out here to continue doing this job for a while. And I do not want to live in this city forever. Trust me, it's just a temporary experience. But yes, it's very true, and they all think they're part of the big game. And I'm watching them all get eviscerated now with the current economic crisis because let's move on to this topic actually, because they lived on a debt-fueled lifestyle. My show is actually called Debt Nation because of the excessive debt around the world and how much pain and anxiety it's causing. And it's in gold because I consider gold and silver real money, especially gold. Gold is a real money. It's a money. It's not just a commodity. Anyway, the Australian economy in this coronavirus era, everyone's self-isolating, everything's slowing down, people are panic buying. You know, I think the panic buying is maybe it's slowing a little now. I'm seeing the supermarkets start to fill up. I'm not seeing as many people rush to the stores now. But what do you see? This has been dramatic, Ron. What do you see? Let's just start with wherever you want to start with this crisis. So you can start with the beginning of the virus and how it's progressed and the disorderly chaos that's been following. I mean, wherever you want to start, you've got an open platter on this one.
Thank you. Look, there's no doubt in my mind that this virus outbreak will create a worldwide depression. I believe that you will see asset prices tumble similar to what they did in Japan 30 years ago.
Yep.
When Japan had that big crash, asset prices fell 40%. And they stayed there. What you need to consider is 30 years later, those prices are still there. They've never, ever risen. Could that happen here? Yes, I believe it could, because there is no doubt in my mind, and I've been saying this now for at least 15 years, we have created an asset bubble for exactly the same reasons we've already discussed. We're putting all of our infrastructure spending into just 3 or 4 major centres in the country, and the real productive areas of the country, which is, it's not just farming, it's our mining industry, our forestry industry, our fishing industry, and all of those sort of things. They are being not just neglected, they're being destroyed. And we have to turn that around, and I can't see any political will in Canberra to do what needs to be done to turn that around. It's just not there. I'm hoping I can convince Keith Pitt, the relatively new Minister for Water, that we've got a plan that will organise water an awful lot better than what it's been done now. But am I confident that we can win that discussion? Not in the least. But you never know. When things get quite drastic, which they obviously are now, sometimes the government might need to just wake up, say, look, I'm sorry, we got that wrong, and we will change course. Because if they don't change course, and I'm referring here now to water,
yeah,
I can absolutely guarantee they are going to lose 6 or 7 seats at the next election. And they won't go to Labor. As I said earlier, they're going to go to other parties and independents, but it'll be sufficient to destroy the government.
Well, yeah, I have to keep across this emerging development because, you know, we want to be on the side of these people who are being ripped off by the system. You know, Ron, I want to ask you, you know, we'll talk about, you know, the asset deflation. Obviously, Japan entered this deflationary era that, you know, you know, they were going to be the superpower of the world in the 80s. And then, like you mentioned, the 90s, they went flat, and they've been flat ever since, and they've done a bunch of different economic packages, RV economics and stuff. We'll talk about all that in a sec. But what I want to ask you, just thinking and reflecting on your time in Australia, looking at the Australian population, the way the Australian population behaved during this COVID-19, you know, we saw the run on toilet paper. Of all things in the world, of all the things in the world, toilet paper isn't going to protect you from a virus. It's a stupid herd mentality. I didn't buy any toilet paper. I got a bunch of toilet paper here just for normal. You know, I got the currency of the future apparently. But, you know, of all the things, toilet paper, saw people fighting in the streets and stuff. What do you think about this behaviour of the Australian population? Is it the behaviour that you recognise from the Australian people? Because I don't recognise it, and I'm not that old. I'm born in 1993, which is, I'm 27 this year. I'm not that old, and I don't recognise this Australia that I saw on the news in the last couple of weeks. To me, it just looked like a bunch of buffoons. What do you say about the population? Do you recognise this as some sort of pattern or what?
No, I don't. No, I find it abhorrent. It's not the Australia I grew up in. I wrote an opinion piece, not about the toilet paper, it was written long before then, but called The Darkening, which was printed in Quadrant, it's probably 12 months or so ago now. But the Australia today is a very different community to the Australia I grew up in.
Yeah.
I grew up during and after the Second World War. We grew up in communities where there was a very big Aboriginal population. We had a huge influx of people from mostly Europe, but also a smattering from Asia and the Middle East after both World Wars. We went to school with all of those people. We played sport with them. We helped one another out at harvest time. We went fishing and shooting together. We're still friends to this day. There was no racism back then. All this racism is quite recent. And what we have done is we've divided Australia into a group of races, all competing to get more money out of Treasury. It's as simple as that. Now, in the process of doing that, the governing class have legislated for themselves sinecures of plenty for life. So it doesn't matter to them who misses out. It doesn't matter to them if we enter a depression, because they are covered for the rest of their life. And when I say the governing class, it spreads down to the ABC and all these other little, webs of that related to the government.
Bureaucracy.
And so we've created a number of tribes out there trying to get a better deal out of Treasury, but we've also created this huge bureaucracy over here who can't miss out no matter what happens. And how we undo that, you're going to have to ask a much wiser man than me. I don't know.
Yeah. I was very shocked, because when I've seen in the history, obviously too young to live in the history, but I've seen in history, United States, the Depression, the Great Depression, a lot of resilience. There was a lot of resilience in that population that came out of World War I. There was a lot of solidarity when the government finally offered to pay them a sort of a welfare system. There was a part of the population that tried to give back the money because they were ashamed of taking the welfare, for an example. People had their own gardens. They had their own local supply chains. There was a sort of a sense of national patriotism and this sort of spirit. I do not feel or see any of that in the United States or in Australia today. I agree with you. I see a bureaucratic class that has created a system of importing people and importing resources and off an old world order that was dying, and now the world order is changing, and that old infrastructure doesn't support it. So they're all getting in their lifeboats. They're all rowing away as quick as they can while they're not supporting the crumbling infrastructure and the crumbling society behind them. And they're saying, no, you work it out. We're going to keep our paychecks and go and live in the Antarctic for a while. It's a disgrace. And, I agree with you. I think, the Liberal Party did a good job of making the population think that it was conservative. It did a good job of playing the jester in a way, and it pulled the wool over people's eyes for long enough. But I think now the duopoly, this Liberal Labor duopoly, is now starting to crack. I think people have finally had enough, and I think it's not. I think it's this virus that might have just pushed people over the edge to say, actually, you know what? We don't want to just support. We don't want to support the old way of doing things anymore, because the old way of doing things has torn our society apart, and they're all floating around now. And we actually want resilience. We want to go back to those old values of being a resilient population. But it's almost too late in some respects. They're going to have to. There's going to be some sort of unwinding. Because there's only so many resources, and if there's a deflationary collapse with the asset prices, so all these people who've come here to speculate on housing, now they're all going to start losing their money while goods and services costs go up. People haven't experienced that before, and they're not going to know what hit them. So their only solution for the population is, we want a bailout, we want money from you guys, and the government is now run out of money. They're running massive deficits. We're back into the debt lifestyle. What do you think?
Look, that's a very, very good summary. In the most telling quote I put in that last paper I wrote is simply this: the food we eat, the water we drink, and the power we use for almost everything we do are only there because previous generations invested their know-how and their money in the future. It is time this generation did the same.
Yeah.
Now, until the government gives to the people, as Steve Jobs from, I can't think of the name but now, Apple said, the only way that people will produce and come up with new ideas is when management gives them the tools they need to be their best. What has this government done? It's not only not given them those, it's taken away the tools they had.
Yeah.
I'll put it in another way. A friend said to me the other day, he said, we've become a nation of bureaucrats and service industries. And he went on to say, he said, there's one thing we can do, and he said, we can make a very good soy latte. And I said, well, just stop and think about that for a minute. I'm not saying we can't make a very good soy latte, but we import the machine that makes it. We import the refrigerator that we put the milk in. We don't even make white goods in Australia anymore. We import the coffee. We import the soy milk. We import the cups and saucers and mugs that you put it in. We import the table and chairs you sit on. Other than the labour, the only thing that we produce in Australia that goes into a soy latte, the sugar.
Yeah, up in North Queensland there.
That's the only thing. All the rest is imported. Now, any wonder we've got a broken economy when you get to that stage?
Yeah. This total, and I've been a China bear from the start. I've never said probably a good word about China in many respects, but I've always been wary of this over-reliance on China. And I think the United States, it was just getting there with Donald Trump, this over-reliance, and they were saying, all right, let's raise the tariff barrier, let's do a bunch of things, let's do import. Let's do a bunch of things to stop this over-reliance. And Trump was trying. I mean, this virus has just put it dead. But you don't want to be too reliant on any one industry. You don't want to be too reliant in your financial portfolio. You don't want to have all in on one industry, because if that cracks, you're gone. You don't want to have just all your money in houses. You don't want to be, as a country, you don't want to be just reliant on one supplier. And I've always been wary of this, definitely this over-reliance on China specifically. But, you can't, because it's greedy. It's greedy. It's not thinking for future generations. And this is something that's really in the debt and deficit era in the United States and in Australia and in Europe and a lot of places. They really are thinking for today. This is the past thinking now. I think this virus is finally, bang! It's finally smacked people into line a little bit. Hopefully we don't come out of this and then start thinking the old way again. I don't think that's possible now. I think the psychology has changed. But I really was frustrated at this greedy notion of just living for today, borrowing from the future, pulling everything out of the future, putting into luxury goods, putting into foreign human capital, so that we could really build up our lifestyles at the expense of the future. Not building dams, not building bridges and roads and infrastructure, and rail and port and health systems, and a whole variety of mechanisms in rural and mining industry and everything that would actually bring security. Our manufacturing is a disgrace. We don't have manufacturing. Not even, think about what you want with Indonesia, but Indonesia is not the worst partner to have. Big population up there. It's quite close, for example. We tried with New Zealand. Again, it's quite far away. But, it's just greed, and it's thinking of today and not thinking of tomorrow. And I think, it's what really found frustrating. And, on the local level, when, especially near the height of this bubble, and it gets tempting as a young person. And I'm saying young person, I don't mean young person. But when I'm looking out and it's the news articles in Domain, or the news articles and they're saying, look at this guy, he owns 27 houses and he's 30 years old. Look at this guy. And this is how he did it on a debt-fueled binge bubble by flipping properties and stuff. This is madness. This is the crazy sort of propaganda, because people don't really understand propaganda nowadays. People didn't live through your time, so they don't see the neoliberal propaganda that goes on that says, just live for today, forget about tomorrow, don't worry about the children, don't worry about all this stuff, flip houses and get rich, and all those miracle boys, all those miracle people with their 27 houses, those guys are going to fall like dominoes in the next few weeks, and it's going to be horrific. But you know what? No politician, no financial analyst, no one on TV, no one said stop, no one said don't do it. Everyone said, yeah, great, well done, keep doing it. And everybody else should be doing this as well. They encourage the population to be stupid and put us in a stupid position. What do you say, Ron?
No, absolutely correct. And while all that was going on, about 20 years ago, I went to China as a representative from the Australian Bureau of Trade. That developed into me going backwards and forwards there, representing several big companies, all of which wanted to do business in China. After doing that for about 3 years and doing it at the very highest level of the Chinese government, I was dealing with the absolute bosses of the Chinese police. You might wonder why I was dealing with the Chinese police. It was because Australia at that stage had some of the best security technology in the world, better than the Yanks, and the Chinese wanted access to it. What became apparent to me after numerous trips up there and signing lengthy documents over days and days and days of negotiation, you could never ever win with the Chinese, because it didn't matter what they signed. Once we started doing some business, they did business the way they wanted to do it, regardless of what the contract said. And in the end, my advice was to the people I was representing, get the hell out of China. There are plenty of other places where you can sell your equipment, and 2 or 3 of them did. The people that stayed there nearly all lost their money, because you can't buy land in China, you can't own real estate, and it doesn't matter what sort of a deal you got. The Chinese are going to plagiarise your intellectual property, and they're going to make it. They'll have a little factory here producing what you've got. They'll have a very, very big factory about a province away producing exactly the same thing, but under a different name.
Yeah.
And that was how they worked.
Yeah, and you're right. And the open door strategy, which you're referring to, that's Richard Nixon and the cadre there, and a whole bunch of others. I just forgot his name. Anyway, the foreign policy guy who undid the Vietnam War. What's his name? Anyway, I'll remember it in a sec. That was one thing, and doing a bit of trade with China is one thing, but when they entered the WTO, now this was an official mandate. This was signaling to the world that they were going to play by the rules. This was in 2001. This was saying from China, we will play by the world rules, WTO rules. And they didn't play. As soon as that happened, I mean, anything before that is arguably forgivable because it was arguably a risk. As soon as they went onto the WTO, anything after that is unforgivable. I always think of the WTO ascension by China as the date of condemnation. That if anybody played with them after that, that was at their risk. It was at their risk before that, but that was cheap labor. Even if you collapsed, whatever, the technology wasn't as advanced. But after the WTO date, if they didn't play forward then they weren't a country to trust. And, it was proven 100 million ways, every direction you could look, that China wasn't worth trusting as a trade partner, not by their regional partners or allies or enemies, whether that be Japan or South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, everybody, Philippines, everybody said the same thing. Russia even is scared of China in that way, even though they try to pretend to be friends. And, as soon as they did that, and then what do? They tried to buy up all the land. That was the next thing. That was the big next step. I remember living in North Queensland, and every other day, we're selling our dairy farm to China. It's a Chinese firm. It's Chinese board of directors, and that's normal ebbs and flows of trade. But the Australian government got greedy, and they almost sold off. There's some big stations in Australia which they were eyeing to sell us some big chunks of stations, which eventually they said, maybe for national security reasons, maybe. I mean, this shouldn't even be a question when you're looking at selling off 1/3 of the country or something like that. I know you know more than I do, but I don't get it. I don't understand. I'm confused. Why is this so hard for them to understand?
It gets back to the fact that we have incompetent people in Canberra. We should not be selling any of our real estate or assets off to Chinese entities. About, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, I was approached from the Beijing, I've forgotten what they call it now. But anyway, it's the biggest food producing and importing company in China. To give you an idea of the size of it, they own 360, one of the big coffee links in USA, Starbucks. I think they own something like 700 or 800 McDonald's outlets, and I could go on from there. What these guys wanted to do was to get me to put in place for them sufficient dairying land that I've forgotten now the total number. I think they wanted to run 60,000 milking cows in Australia. Anyway, I went to the Minister for Agriculture and I told him, and I just said, I am not going to facilitate that because I don't think it's in Australia's best interests. But look what's happened. They sat on their hands for a while. In the last few years, a very large proportion of our dairying industry, and it's not so much the land with a lot of these agricultural things, it's the secondary industry that flows on from it. They've been bought out, and we've now got our milk formula, our baby formula, and our fresh milk all going direct to China. And you wonder why we're in trouble. But if I can just raise another point.
Yeah, please do.
It was brought up the other day because of the so-called free trade agreement with Indonesia. Now, I have argued this and I've had the discussion with government at the highest levels. Any free trade agreement with another major country that has costs of production dramatically lower than ours is not a free trade agreement. It's a job exporting agreement. That's all it is. And the latest one with Indonesia is a classic example.
Yeah.
It's just crazy stuff. But the government thinks it's good because it sounds good. Oh, we've got a free trade agreement. Oh, yeah, we can do this, we can do that. Yeah, but who's the winner? It's not Australia, it's Indonesia. And, this has been the case.
Do you think to remedy some of this problems, like, because it's a lot of this comes down to the currency. We have a national currency and the currency price fluctuates, and we have to write these agreements to mitigate currency risk. What if we opened up a new currency in, say, Northern Territory, for example, and you just made that a whole new place with its own currency, and it would be weak relative to the Australian dollar, and you could just do all your trading with the Northern Territory. You could open up your manufacturing there, and it'd be all weak, and you could just export back and forth. I mean, I know it would reduce the aggregate, and I know that we struggle for federation as a united country and all that, but would that be something to mitigating this currency problem? Because like a lot of these free trade agreements are based on the currency risk and the acquisition of goods and services. If Indonesia can produce soybeans more than we can't really, we can't just magically produce soybeans or something, What do you say to that?
Look, I don't profess to be any sort of an expert in international currencies. I'll sidestep that one. But the one thing
my idea. Do you know the problem, right? That's the big problem, right?
The big problem goes to, and you raised the issue earlier. There's so many people out there that believe if the Australian currency crashes, it's good for export industries.
Oh, can I just hold your thought there?
Yeah.
I just remembered his name. It's Henry Kissinger. Yeah, that's the guy I was trying to think of.
I said it a while ago, but you missed it. Once our currency drops like it does at the moment, we effectively increase our debt by 40%. You've got to pay it back with a weaker currency.
Yeah.
Now, no one seems to worry about our debt. They did there about 18 months, 2 years ago. All of a sudden, all bets are off. We're borrowing money like there's no tomorrow. Somebody's going to wake up when this virus thing's all over, in 6 months' time, and say, oh, look, our debt's grown now to $850 billion or whatever it is. How are we ever going to pay that off? Well, I would say with considerable difficulty, and it'll be my great-grandkids or great-great-great-grandkids that'll be saddled with that debt. And sooner or later, interest rates will rise again, and we'll have a burden there that we can't fix. And you have to appreciate, and I said this when I was on the campaign trail in 2016, and they were talking about getting the budget back into the black and paying down the debt. And I said, do you realise what a big issue paying down the debt is? They're talking about a surplus of $30 to $40 million. Divide 40 million into 600 million, and you'll get just a bit of an idea how many years it'll take you to pay it off. It's the task we have given our future generations is horrific.
It's horrific. It's horrific in the fact that it's compounding because we're not investing in the critical infrastructure that you're talking about, and investing in our rural communities, and investing in our population in a way that will generate more productivity, which will allow us to pay down this debt in the future faster than we would have, because a lot of it is frivolous spending. A lot of it's, it's kind of like what you were talking about before. It's kind of like the snowy hydro scheme idea. Keep the lights on 4 till 11 and peak power, but don't use it for agriculture. It's that same mentality, but nationwide. And it's really disturbing. I am worried about it. I'm worried about the future, and I'm worried. I'm interested to see what let's quickly just shift gears a tiny little bit to what do you think this crash is, this slide in the stock market, this crash that we've had here, the panic buying, what do you think this has done to the psychology of Australia they're starting to think about things differently now. What do you think? When we woke up at the beginning of 2020, we were all thinking a specific way. After this, or during, now the psychology is being shaped and changed. What do you think the change is for Australia now? It's dramatic. It's not so dramatic for someone like yourself, who, you've seen this movie before. But for my generation, we've never seen anything like this, so we're learning a lot of lessons. A lot of the new arrivals are learning a lot of lessons about stuff. And businesses learning a lot of lessons. What do you think the psychology is now and into the future? How it will be reshaped? What is the psychology of Australia?
Look, I think, well, the psychology at the moment is whatever I need, I want it from government, and I want it now. And that's we've brought up a whole generation of kids or younger people that believe that the Paris Agreement was important and we had to fight climate change. And for goodness sake. And of course, we had condescending politicians who lacked the guts to say any bloody different. But what will happen as a result of this depression, recession, call it what you like, is every person in Australia will have to do a rethink about their current situation. It will affect everybody. Sadly, with the exception of the governing class, as I said, but it will affect everybody else. And you can already see that in what I said earlier. Across the Murray-Darling Basin now, I'm saying 1.5 million, it's probably nearer to 2 million people who they're not angry with the Liberal Party, they're not angry with the National Party or the Labor Party, they're angry with government, full stop. And they are passionate enough and they are hurt enough that they will change the government, make no mistake. And I suspect that the representatives that replace some of those failed politicians will be, somewhere in there will be a man of the hour that will show some leadership. And we have to get back and appreciate that productivity doesn't just happen. It's the result of serious intellectual planning. It's the result of a vision for the future. And the planning has to be based on the vast resources that should make Australia the most productive and prosperous country on earth. We can be.
We can be. We should be the richest country on the planet, but we're not.
No, our standard of living currently is falling. And the wage earner knows that because he's had no wage rise now for several years. But all of a sudden, he's going into the supermarket, particularly as a result of what's happened in the last few weeks. And his costs are going up and up and up. And, and then he says, he looks at the evening news and he said, the price of fuel will be cheaper tomorrow. I'll go and fill the car up. And as you quite correctly pointed out, because of the falling dollar, it hasn't got much cheaper at all. So
yeah,
he misses out all around.
Yeah,
and
no, it's been interesting.
Angry voters are very, very unpredictable.
Yeah.
A lot of people say, they'll go into the voting booth and they'll just vote the way they have for the last 20 years. They certainly did that last time, but I can see a very, very different mood out there now. Very different.
Yeah, the like I said, like the Liberal Party and the Labor Party to a lesser extent, they pushed a little bit too hard on the Liberal side, especially some of the social stuff, which scared the population a little bit. But the Liberal Party definitely did a good job of the veil, obfuscation, that everything was business as usual. And, the thing about the Liberal Party is the Liberal Party, whenever they want to pretend to be nationalists, they hide behind the Nationals. That's what they do. They put the Nationals out in front and they say, we are them, we are them, we are them. But really, they're not. They're completely different to the Nationals, and they hide behind this shield. And I think it's the Nationals that are cracking because people realize if they can break the Nationals, that really gives the Liberals nowhere to hide anymore.
I'll put it another way, and I was a very well-known member of the National Party up until I resigned about 6 years ago, whenever it was, 5 years ago, something like that. The Nationals virtually don't exist anymore. They'll disappear at the next election. And the reason for that is they stand for nothing anymore.
Yeah.
The last annual conference I went to for the Nationals, which was in Bathurst, we passed 6 major motions to do with infrastructure, all of which were passed unanimously. Why did I leave the National Party? 18 months after that, the leader at the time stood up and spent 20 minutes lying his head off, saying that all of the motions from the National Conference had been implemented. In actual fact, not one of them had been implemented. Not one of them's even been implemented now. So the Nationals now are simply a group of people that hang on to the skirt of the Liberal Party because that's how they get political appointment. And you've got the classic case I mentioned when you have a leader of a party like Michael McCormick, who is totally opposed to regional people and what regional people do, you've got a fraud of a party and a fraud of a leader. And
well said.
They will pay for that at the next election because the people are now awake to it.
Yep, well said.
They weren't before, but they are now.
All right, Ron Pike. Well, that's an hour. I don't want to hold you here forever. Unless you want to talk about anything else, please go ahead. Tell me if you want to talk about another subject or something. But otherwise, I think that's a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
I appreciate the opportunity to express views. I may not be right in all I say, but unless the government or some other party effectively takes on what is in that document, The Road to National Prosperity, Australia will continue to regress.
I actually have read that. I have read that document through Michael Smythe, who is a very big advocate of that document. He always pushes it around to people. So I thank Michael for that, and I thank you for participating in drawing up that document. And something like the Bradfield scheme is a big economic infrastructure project or related scheme that could get this country moving in a direction. Now that's a good stimulus package, a fiscal stimulus package. That really could get this country moving in a better direction, especially with relation to water security. And I am a big fan of water security in this country. And we'll talk next time we'll talk more about some technologies that are coming around the curve, like desalination, and if they're even relevant, or what else do we need apart from dams, or some other projects as well, because you mentioned storage units. Quickly, what would those storage units look like? Would they be concrete facilities? Are you talking about more dams? Are you talking about
the earth and rock filled dams, like most of the dams around the world? And every country in the world has been building dams for the last 40 years, with the exception of the country with the most unreliable rainfall.
Yeah.
Just before we go, and this is important, the only water we have to use is the water that runs off after precipitation. It ends up in our rivers and creeks. That's the water we use. Every year, from mainland Australia, on average, 290 million megalitres of water flow into the sea. 290 million. You know how much of that we actually use? And this includes agriculture, municipalities, a lot. 4%.
Yeah, fraction.
And yet we've got clowns in Canberra, and particularly bureaucrats in Canberra, and there was an article in the Australian last week, which I've put out a contrary article that they haven't printed yet. They're saying Australia's short of water. We are one of the countries on earth with the most abundant water supply you could ever imagine. But no, we're short of water.
Do you follow the water tables of the Great Artesian Basin, by the way?
The Great Artesian Basin is 360,000 Sydney harbours.
That's good.
We couldn't ever use it, no matter what we did. The current rate of usage doesn't even keep up with the inflow. And the thing you've got to remember about the Great Artesian Basin, the water in it is not mostly suitable for agriculture. It's saline. It's okay for stock water. It's okay for human consumption to a degree. And of course, it's ideally available for industrial purposes. But when people talk about the Great Artesian Basin, most of them don't appreciate that in the lower Murrumbidgee, starting at Narrandera and going out to west of Hay, we have the biggest potable water aquifer in the world. Most people haven't heard of it. I developed 2 high volume bores on that in 1980s. It contains 2,000 Burrinjuck dams of water. But guess what? All of those areas out there during the last couple of periods when we've had no water out of the rivers and it was fairly dry, the New South Wales government has halted people taking water out of it. The amount of water that's been licensed to take out of it at the moment, if we kept taking that out and it never rained again and the Murrumbidgee ran dry and there was no inflow, it would take 3,700 years to pump out half of that water. The bureaucrats are saying it's overcommitted. Now, either I'm an idiot or they're an idiot. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, well, I don't trust government, so I'm going to lean on the side of you because I've seen the incompetence of government all over the world, and I know they can make some pretty big mistakes. And just seeing the way that they've handled this virus, the disinformation, the discoordination, the way they've handled it has been atrocious. Leaving the flights open for so long. I don't know what you thought about that, but they a whole bunch of problems. Lots of problems, and not having enough ICU beds. So now we all have to hang on a thread of a string. It's just horrible. Anyway, all right, Ron. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I want to thank all our Patreon supporters who are helping keep this show on the road. So thank you all to all of you, and also Future Humanity Project, who says future is in your hands. And thanks to Ron Pike too. Thank you very much for coming on. And Ron, send us anything, anybody you want me to talk to or interview about these subjects, especially any of these political people who are rising up into the chaos that is the Labor Liberal. The Labor Liberal duopoly, but the national collapse and the National Party collapse. So that's really exciting to see for the rural people of Australia, because they've been disenfranchised, they've been left in, you've been used, they've been asset stripped, they've been abused by the urban populations and by the elites in Canberra. They've been abused by the bureaucratic class as a resource that they can draw water from the well. And now the well is running dry. They want to. That's not a good analogy, but they want to smack the mule. They want to punish the mule for not being able. For having a broken foot. It broke its foot, and because it was used up too much, and now they want to whack it. And it's not time for whacking. It's time for fixing the foot and giving it food and nutrition and getting it back on the road. It's a disgrace. So that's a bad analogy, poor ending to the show, but you kind of get the concept that I'm trying to say. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ron. And we'll be talking soon.
It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's Debt Nation, where we're busy putting death out of business. Thank you, Ron Pike.